long before the Netherlands became a nation of merchants and explorers, long before its windmills dotted the horizon and its painters captured the light of its skies, the land itself was still being born. This was not yet the Netherlands, but a restless frontier between sea and river, earth and water, life and death. Imagine a place where the coastline was never fixed, where rivers changed their courses overnight, where the very ground beneath your feet could sink into marsh or rise again after the tide. To live here was to live on borrowed time each day, a negotiation with nature itself. And yet, against all odds, people came. They came with fire, with stone, with dreams of survival. They left footprints in the mud, built paths across swamps, and carved out lives in a landscape that constantly threatened to take everything back. This is where the Dutch story begins, not with kings or cities, but with the first humans who dared to call this shifting land home. The earliest known inhabitants of the Low Countries arrived hundreds of thousands of years ago, during the Paleolithic era. These were not settlers in the way we think of them today, but small bands of hunter-gatherers moving with the seasons, following herds of animals across a harsh and unforgiving land. At that time, vast sheets of ice had sculpted the region. The glaciers carved valleys and deposited sand and clay, shaping the rivers that would later define Dutch history. When the ice retreated, it left behind a landscape of rolling dunes, fertile floodplains, and treacherous wetlands. Mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses roamed the plains, while reindeer herds grazed in the tundra-like stretches. Archaeologists in Limburg have found stone tools more than 250,000 years old, evidence that early humans, perhaps Neanderthals, hunted here long before the modern Dutch landscape took shape. Life was brutal. Survival depended on mobility, on knowing when to follow the animals, when to fish the rivers, when to retreat from floods. The people left behind little more than flint blades and scattered bones. Yet even these silent traces tell us something profound. Humanity was here, testing its strength against the land. As time passed, the Ice Age gave way to warmer periods. By around 8000 BCE, in what archaeologists call the Mesolithic Age, the Low Countries had become a world of rivers, forests, and coastlines. The sea crept inland, swallowing old hunting grounds. The rivers meandered endlessly, cutting new paths, flooding old ones. For the people who lived here, water was no longer an occasional threat, it was a permanent fact of life. And so they adapted. Mesolithic communities developed dugout canoes from hollowed tree trunks, sleek vessels that could glide across the flooded plains. They fished with bone hooks and nets woven from plant fibers. They hunted deer and wild boar in the forests, and waterfowl in the marshes. Archaeologists have discovered wooden trackways, plank roads laid carefully across bogs, allowing people to move through the wetlands without sinking. These trackways are among the oldest examples of Dutch engineering, proof that even in prehistory, people were already learning to bend the land to their will. The Neolithic Revolution arrived around 5300 BCE, carried into the Low Countries by farmers from Central Europe. These people, part of what is known as the Linebankaramic culture, brought with them domesticated animals, cultivated crops, and a new way of life. They built longhouses, large wooden structures that could shelter extended families and their livestock. They tilled the soil, growing wheat and barley, and raised cattle, sheep, and pigs. For the first time, permanent villages appeared in the Dutch landscape. But farming here was never easy. The rivers could flood suddenly, washing away fields and homes. Heavy rains could turn fertile soil into mud, while the encroaching sea threatened to reclaim the land. The farmers learned to adapt, combining agriculture with fishing and foraging, hedging their survival against the whims of nature. Pottery fragments from this time reveal not only their practicality, but also their creativity's simple designs. Scratched into clay, reminders that even in harsh conditions, people sought beauty and meaning. As centuries passed, the Neolithic farmers gave way to Bronze Age societies. From about 2000 BCE onward, the Low Countries became part of a vast web of trade stretching across Europe. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was rare here, but it was prized. Communities exchanged amber, salt, and livestock for the precious metal, which was shaped into swords, axes, and ornaments. The landscape changed again, dotted now with burial mounds, circular earthworks that housed the remains of chieftains and warriors, buried with weapons, jewelry, and offerings. These burial mounds, some of which still stand today, remind us that these early people were not only farmers and traders, but also dreamers of the afterlife. They believed that death was not an end but a passage, and that the spirits of their ancestors watched over them. Ritual offerings have been found in bogs and river swords, ornaments, and sometimes even human remains, placed carefully into the water as gifts to unseen gods. The land was not just physical, it was sacred, alive with forces that demanded respect. By the Iron Age, around 800 BCE, the societies of the Low Countries had grown more complex. Iron tools and weapons were stronger and more reliable than bronze, allowing communities to farm more effectively and defend themselves more fiercely. Villages expanded, social hierarchies deepened, and tribal identities began to emerge. The Low Countries were no longer a scattered wilderness, they were a crossroads of two great cultural worlds, the Celts in the south, and the Germanic tribes in the north. The Celts brought with them a vibrant culture of warriors, druids, and artisans. They settled in the southern Low Countries, especially in what is now Belgium and southern Netherlands. The Eburones, Nervi, and Manapi were among the prominent tribes, each ruling its territory with fortified settlements and warrior chieftains. They traded with neighboring tribes, farmed the land, and followed spiritual traditions tied to nature and the cycles of life. To the north, the Germanic tribes lived in harsher conditions. The Frisians, Batavians, and Chocci built their homes on raised mounds called Turpen, artificial hills of earth that lifted their villages above the floods. They were skilled sailors, navigating the coastal waters and rivers with ease. Their society was less hierarchical than the Celts, built more on kinship and loyalty than on rigid class. They valued independence, and their lives were closely bound to the sea. These two worlds, Celtic and Germanic, did not exist in isolation. They traded, they fought, and sometimes they intermarried. The Low Countries became a cultural frontier, a place where traditions mingled and clashed. To outsiders, especially the expanding Roman Empire, the region was both tempting and terrifying, rich in resources, but fiercely defended by tribes who knew every river and swamp like the back of their hand. When Julius Caesar launched his campaigns into Gaul in the 1st century BCE, the Low Countries became part of Rome's grand designs. Caesar wrote of the tribes he encountered, describing them as both noble and savage, allies and enemies. His legions clashed with the Nervi, whose ambush nearly destroyed a Roman army, and with the Eburones, whose leader Ambiorix became legendary for resisting Roman domination. The Celts of the south felt the full weight of Rome's military machine, their lands devastated, their people subjugated. The Germanic tribes to the north, however, remained more elusive. The Rhine River became Rome's frontier, a boundary between the empire and the untamed lands beyond. Along this line, the Romans built forts, roads, and watchtowers. Towns sprang up near the frontier, blending Roman architecture with local traditions. Soldiers, merchants, and settlers brought Latin, Roman law, and new gods, leaving behind mosaics, amphorae, and coins as proof of their presence. Yet the frontier was never secure. The Batavians, a Germanic tribe living in what is now the central Netherlands, initially allied with Rome. They supplied cavalry to the Roman legions, their riders renowned for their skill and bravery. But in the year 69 CE, led by the charismatic chieftain Julius Civilis, the Batavians rose in revolt. They destroyed Roman forts, rallied neighboring tribes, and for a brief moment threatened to drive Rome from the region. The Batavian revolt was eventually crushed, but it left a mark on history. It showed that the tribes of the Low Countries were not passive subjects, but active players in the great struggles of their age. They could ally with Rome, they could rebel against it, and in doing so, they forged identities that would endure long after the legions departed. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Roman Empire began to falter. Pressured by invasions, weakened by internal strife, Rome could no longer hold its northern frontiers. The forts along the Rhine fell silent, the roads crumbled, and the towns emptied. In their place, new waves of Germanic peoples moved in, reshaping the land once more. The Roman presence faded, but it left behind traces in language, inroads, in the idea of order that would echo in Dutch history for centuries to come. And so, as the Roman era drew to a close, the Low Countries stood at a crossroads once again, a land shaped by water, by tribes, by conquest, and by survival. It was not yet the Netherlands, but the foundations had been laid. Out of this patchwork of Celts, Germans, and Romans, a people would one day emerge who could master the rivers, tame the seas, and build a nation where none had seemed possible. When the legions of Rome withdrew in the 5th century, the Low Countries were left adrift. The great frontier along the Rhine, once bristling with forts and outposts, fell silent. Roads that had carried soldiers and merchants crumbled into overgrown tracks. Towns that had been Roman outposts emptied as trade collapsed, and the empire's protection vanished. To many, it must have felt as if the world itself was ending. But in truth, the collapse of Roman power was not an ending. It was a transformation. Out of the ruins, new peoples and powers would rise. The centuries that followed are often called the Dark Ages, but in the Low Countries, this was a time of profound change. Tribes became kingdoms. Old Roman landscapes became new medieval frontiers, and the seeds of the Dutch identity, resilience, independence, and survival against great odds were planted in this turbulent soil. The vacuum left by Rome invited migrations. Germanic tribes moved into the abandoned Roman provinces, reshaping the cultural and political map of Europe. In the Low Countries, the most significant newcomers were the Franks. Originating from regions along the Rhine, the Franks expanded west and south, absorbing Gallo-Roman lands and establishing one of the most powerful kingdoms of the early medieval world. By the late 5th century, the Frankish chieftain Clovis I united many Frankish groups under his rule. His victory at the Battle of Soissons in 486 marked the beginning of Frankish dominance in northern Gaul. Clovis's conversion to Christianity, encouraged by his wife Clotilde, bound the Franks to the Roman Church and gave their rule divine legitimacy. For the peoples of the southern Low Countries, this meant that their lands were now drawn into the orbit of the Merovingian dynasty. But the Franks were not the only force in the region. Along the northern coasts and river deltas, the Frisians held sway. Fiercely independent, skilled sailors and traders, the Frisians thrived in the watery landscapes of what is now Friesland and Holland. Their settlements were built on terpenatitial mounds of earth that lifted their homes above the tides. From these strongholds, they controlled coastal trade routes that connected Scandinavia, Britain, and the Frankish heartlands. To the east, other Germanic groups like the Saxons maintained their presence, particularly in what is now eastern Netherlands and northwestern Germany. The Saxons were known for their warrior culture and their resistance to outside domination. For centuries, they resisted Frankish attempts at conquest, clinging to their own pagan gods and local traditions. This patchwork of Franks, Frisians, and Saxons defined the Low Countries in the early Middle Ages, a frontier between Christianity and paganism, between centralized kingdoms and tribal independence, between land and sea. Life in these centuries was not easy. Without the structure of Rome, towns shrank, trade routes faltered, and much of the population lived in rural villages. Agriculture was the backbone of survival, with people growing barley, rye, and oats, and raising cattle, pigs, and sheep. Wooden halls housed extended families, while small churches of fan built on the ruins of Roman villas began to dot the landscape as Christianity slowly spread. Yet even in these so-called dark centuries, there was light. The monasteries of the Merovingian and later Carolingian worlds became centers of learning and preservation. Monks copied ancient manuscripts, cultivated new agricultural techniques, and spread the Christian faith into the Frisian and Saxon frontiers. Missionaries like Saint Willibrord in the late 7th century, followed by Saint Boniface, braved dangerous journeys into the wetlands and forests, preaching to the pagan tribes. Boniface's dramatic martyrdom in 754 near Dokkum, cut down by Frisian warriors while carrying the Bible, symbolized both the dangers of this mission and the ferocity of local resistance. But Christianity was relentless, backed by Frankish power. By the 8th century, the Frisians had been drawn, sometimes by persuasion and sometimes by the sword, into the Christian fold. The Saxons, however, resisted fiercely. It took the brutal campaigns of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, to subdue them in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. For decades, the Saxons fought a bitter war of survival, but Charlemagne's armies prevailed, and the region was folded into his vast empire. Charlemagne's reign marked a turning point for the Low Countries. From his capital at Aachen, not far from the Dutch border, he forged a vision of a united Christendom in Europe. Under his rule, the Low Countries were not just borderlands, they were integral parts of the Carolingian Empire. Imperial counts governed provinces, monasteries flourished, and new trade routes reconnected the region to the wider world. The The rivers of the Netherlands once again became highways of commerce. Merchants carried salt, wool, and grain to distant markets. Towns like Utrecht began to grow as centers of administration and religion. The old Roman roads were patched and used once more, while new churches rose over pagan shrines. The landscape of the Low Countries was being remade not as a Roman frontier, but as a Christian province of a Frankish empire. And yet, peace never lasted long in this fragile land. The very waterways that sustained trade also invited danger. From the late 8th century onward, a new menace appeared on the horizon. The Vikings, the Norse seafarers, sailing sleek longships from Scandinavia, found in the Low Countries a tempting target. Its rivers offered easy access inland, its towns were rich with goods, and its monasteries were filled with treasures. Viking raids struck terror into the hearts of coastal communities. Dorestad, a thriving trade center near modern Utrecht, was attacked repeatedly in the 9th century. Its wealth plundered, its people enslaved. Monasteries burned, villages were abandoned, and the fragile order imposed by the Carolingians began to unravel. The Frankish rulers struggled to respond. Charlemagne's successors were weaker, his empire divided among heirs. Local counts and bishops were left to defend their lands as best they could, building wooden fortifications and rallying militias. Some even struck deals with the Vikings, paying them tribute or granting them land in exchange for peace. It was in this crucible of chaos between Frankish kings, Viking raiders, and stubborn local tribes that the seeds of Dutch independence were sown. The people of the Low Countries learned to fend for themselves, to rely on local leaders, and to adapt once more to a world in constant flux. By the 10th century, as Viking raids waned and Europe stabilized, the Low Countries began to emerge from the shadows of the early Middle Ages. The Carolingian Empire had fragmented, giving rise to local lordships and counties. In the Netherlands, this meant the rise of regional powers: counts of Holland, lords of Friesland, bishops of Utrecht. These rulers, though often nominally subjects of distant kings or emperors, wielded real authority on the ground. Villages grew into market towns. Dikes and drainage systems, first built in small scale by local communities, began to reclaim land from the sea. The struggle with water, constant since prehistory, took on a new form, not just survival, but conquest. Step by step, people turned marshes into meadows, swamps into fields. This mastery over water would become the hallmark of Dutch history, but its roots lay in the ingenuity of these early medieval farmers and lords. By the year 1000, the Low Countries were no longer the abandoned frontier of a fallen empire. They were a patchwork of counties and bishoprics, Christianized, partially urbanized, and integrated into the growing networks of medieval Europe. They had endured Rome's collapse, survived Frankish conquest, resisted Viking terror, and tamed their own environment. What emerged was not yet the Netherlands as we know it, but something unmistakably Dutch, a people shaped by struggle, hardened by floods and raids, and united by the constant need to defend and cultivate their fragile land. The stage was now set for the next chapter, the High Middle Ages, when towns would flourish, trade would boom, and the Low Countries would begin their rise to become some of the wealthiest and most vibrant lands in Europe. The 11th century marked a turning point in the history of the Low Countries. For centuries, this land of rivers, marshes, and coasts had been shaped by survival, by farming on reclaimed land, by trading within villages, and by the authority of lords and bishops. But as Europe entered the High Middle Ages, new forces transformed the region. Towns began to rise, trade expanded across the seas, and feudal lords carved their ambitions into stone. The Low Countries were no longer a quiet frontier. They were becoming one of the most vibrant crossroads of medieval Europe. The first transformation came with the growth of towns and trade centers. Among the earliest to thrive was Utrecht, once a Roman fortress and later the seat of a powerful bishop. Utrecht grew into a bustling center of faith and commerce. Its cathedral and cloisters drew pilgrims, while its markets connected the countryside to long-distance trade. Farmers brought grain, cheese, and livestock, while merchants sold cloth, salt, and wine. Guilds began to appear, regulating crafts and protecting their members, giving the town an organized and distinctive identity. Further west, a settlement in the wetlands of Flanders began its meteoric rise. Bruges, its connection to the sea through tidal inlets, gave it access to northern and southern Europe alike. By the 12th century, Bruges was flourishing as a hub of international trade. English wool arrived in its markets, feeding a booming Flemish textile industry. Italian merchants brought spices, silks, and luxury goods from the Mediterranean. The weaving halls of Bruges produced fine cloth that was sold from France to Germany, from Scandinavia to the Levant. In a time when most of Europe remained rural, Bruges shone as a cosmopolitan city, earning its later title as the Venice of the North. This urban wealth created a new class of people, the burghers, merchants, and craftsmen, who demanded rights and recognition. Town charters granted them freedoms unheard of in the feudal countryside, the right to hold markets, to govern themselves through councils, and to resist arbitrary taxation. For the first time in history, ordinary citizens outside of the nobility or the clergy could wield political and economic influence. It was a quiet revolution, one that would echo across the centuries of Dutch history. But prosperity did not erase the world of feudal lords and local duchies. The Low Countries were fragmented into a patchwork of competing powers. The county of Flanders grew enormously rich, so much so that its counts often stood toe-to-toe with the kings of France. The county of Holland, still young and expanding, fought to wrest land from the sea, constructing dikes and reclaiming fertile. The Duchy of Brabant emerged as a strong principality in the center, its dukes ambitious in both politics and war, and the Bishop of Utrecht, wielding both spiritual and temporal power, ruled vast tracts of land backed by the authority of the church. Alliances shifted constantly. Counts clashed with dukes, bishops struggled with towns, and kings to the south sought to impose their authority. Castles rose across the landscape, not only as fortresses but as symbols of pride and legitimacy. Yet even amidst this rivalry, lords increasingly relied on towns. In exchange for money and loyalty, rulers granted privileges, exemptions, and rights, giving cities a unique place in the feudal order. The balance of power in the Low Countries was unlike anywhere else in Europe, a delicate dance between nobles who wanted authority and towns that demanded independence. By the 13th century, the Low Countries were no longer isolated. They became part of a vast commercial network, the Hanseatic League. Born in Germany, the League united merchants and cities from the Baltic to the North Sea, creating a system of trade that spanned thousands of miles. Dutch and Flemish towns quickly joined this network. Ports like Kampen, Deventer, and Zeewolde on the IJssel River grew into vibrant trade centers, sending goods inland and overseas. Ships carried grain from the Baltic, timber from Scandinavia, and salted fish from the North Sea, while exporting the cloth and textiles of Flanders and Brabant. The Hanseatic League did more than move goods, it offered security. Merchants traveled under its protection, convoys defended ships against pirates, and agreements standardized trade, building trust in an uncertain world. For the people of the Low Countries, this meant abundance. Markets displayed goods from across Europe and beyond. Russian furs, French wines, Portuguese salt, North Sea herring, and spices from the East. The diet, clothing, and daily lives of townspeople grew richer and more varied than any generation before them. Prosperity became the hallmark of these centuries. By the year 1300, the Low Countries had been utterly transformed. Towns like Utrecht and Bruges had become powerful centers of commerce. Lords and bishops had established duchies and counties, their castles rising above the flat landscape, and the Hanseatic League had bound the region into the wider fabric of European trade. The Low Countries were no longer a collection of scattered villages. They were a dynamic region, wealthy, ambitious, and deeply connected to the outside world. Yet prosperity also brought competition, conflict, and the seeds of future struggles. The centuries ahead would test whether this balance between towns, lords, and trade could endure, whether it would break under the weight of ambition and power. In the waning years of the 13th century, the Low Countries stood transformed. What had once been a patchwork of marshlands, scattered hamlets, and quiet monasteries had become one of the most prosperous and dynamic regions of Europe. Life here was no longer defined only by the rhythms of farming and the shadow of castles. Instead, the pulse of the land now echoed in crowded marketplaces, in the clang of hammers on anvils, in the hum of looms weaving fine cloth, and in the creak of ships' timbers as merchants loaded them with cargo for voyages across the North Sea and the Baltic. The High Middle Ages had brought profound change, and nowhere was this more visible than in the rise of the towns. A traveler approaching Bruges during this age would have been struck first by the sight of its waterways. a lattice of canals and inlets that linked the city directly to the sea. The docks bustled with activity as ships from England, Scandinavia, and the Hanseatic ports arrived with wool, timber, furs, and grain. Italian galleys brought spices, silks, and wines from the Mediterranean. The city seemed a magnet drawing in the wealth of distant lands. Inside its walls, the streets twisted into narrow lanes lined with tall wooden houses, their gables leaning precariously over cobblestones polished by centuries of footsteps. The air carried a mingling of scents, the pungency of tanned leather, the sweetness of imported spices, the salt of the nearby sea, and the less pleasant odors of livestock and refuse. Bruges was alive with sound merchants, haggling, guildsmen debating rules, carts rattling, bells tolling from the belfry that loomed over the market square. For the people of Bruges, prosperity was not merely measured in wealth, but in freedom. Unlike the serfs tied to the land outside the city, the burghers of Bruges held rights enshrined in charters. They could elect councils, regulate markets, and guard their own privileges. The communal spirit of the townspeople gave Bruges an identity distinct from the countryside. Here, a man's fortune was determined not by his birth into noble blood, but by his skill, his diligence, or his daring in trade. This independence sometimes led to confrontation with the Counts of Flanders, who claimed ultimate authority. Yet the wealth of the towns was too great to ignore. Time and again, lords found themselves negotiating with merchants, granting liberties in exchange for taxes or loans to fund wars. Thus, power in the Low Countries began to shift, not fully but unmistakably, from castles to marketplaces. Further inland, Utrecht represented a different but equally important urban story. Built on the ruins of an old Roman fortress, Utrecht had long been the seat of bishops, who wielded both spiritual and temporal power. Its cathedral chapter and ecclesiastical institutions made it a center of religion, yet its markets and guilds gave it the vigor of a city tied to commerce. Pilgrims arrived to venerate relics, scholars gathered in clerical schools, and merchants traded in grain, livestock, and cloth. The Bishop of Utrecht often found himself balancing his dual role as shepherd of souls and ruler of lands, yet increasingly he was forced to accommodate the ambitions of townspeople eager to assert their own influence. The very stones of the city reflected this tension. Sacred cloisters and churches stood beside busy markets and guild halls, each claiming its place in the life of the community. These towns were not isolated phenomena. Across the Low Countries, from Ghent and Ypres in Flanders to Deventer and Kampen, along the Eidstal urban centers grew and flourished. They became magnets for population as peasants left the land in search of opportunity. The legal tradition of town heir makes free meant that serfs, who lived in a town for a year and a day without being reclaimed, could claim liberty. This promise of freedom gave towns a revolutionary appeal. A new class of burghers, neither noble nor peasant, emerged, defined by their participation in commerce, crafts, and civic life. Guilds regulated trades, setting standards for quality and prices, while also serving as brotherhoods that provided support in times of illness or death. Festivals and processions sponsored by these guilds filled the streets with color, uniting the community in displays of civic pride. Yet the rise of towns did not erase the power of the lords. The Low Countries remained a patchwork of feudal territories, each with its own ambitions. The Counts of Flanders held sway over some of the wealthiest lands in Europe. Their coffers swelled with taxes from Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, and they wielded armies strong enough to challenge even the kings of France. At the same time, they faced constant negotiation with their own towns, whose wealth gave them leverage to demand privileges and protections. In Holland, the Counts faced a different challenge. The land itself, much of their territory lay below sea level, vulnerable to floods. Here, survival depended on collective effort. Villages and towns built dikes and canals, drained marshes, and created new farmland. The Counts oversaw these works, but they could not complete them without the cooperation of local communities. Out of necessity grew a tradition of shared responsibility that would shape Dutch identity for centuries. Brabant too rose as a duchy of importance, its dukes ruling from Leuven and later Brussels. Strategically positioned between France and the Holy Roman Empire, Brabant became a hub for trade and diplomacy. Its fairs attracted merchants from across Europe, and its dukes encouraged commerce as a means of strengthening their position. Meanwhile, the bishops of Utrecht maintained their unusual status as both ecclesiastical leaders and secular rulers, commanding armies and defending lands while preaching the word of God. But their power was increasingly contested by secular lords and by the very towns that flourished within their dioceses. Amid this shifting landscape of lords and towns, one force bound the Low Countries ever more firmly into the fabric of Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League. What began as a loose alliance of German towns had, by the 13th century, grown into a vast commercial network stretching from the Baltic to the North Sea. Dutch towns like Deventer-Kampen and Exola joined this league, sending their ships eastward to Lubeck, Danzig, and Novgorod. They brought back grain, timber, and furs, vital commodities for a land with limited resources but growing mouths to feed. In exchange, they exported cloth, dairy products, and salted fish, goods that found eager buyers across Europe. The League provided not only economic opportunity but also protection. Its merchants traveled in convoys, defended by armed ships against pirates. Disputes were resolved in Hanseatic courts, and common standards of weights and measures ensured fair dealing. For Dutch merchants, membership in the League meant security and prestige, linking their fortunes to a network that reached across Northern Europe. Bruges in particular became a hub for Hanseatic trade. Its warehouses stored goods from the Baltic, its markets bustled with northern merchants, and its counting houses rang with the clink of coins changing hands. The city became known as the Venice of the North, a place where north and south, east and west converged in a cosmopolitan whirl of commerce. Daily life reflected these larger changes. In Bruges, a master weaver might employ dozens of apprentices and journeymen, producing fine cloth destined for Italy or Spain. In Utrecht, a money changer sat at his bench, exchanging currencies for travelers from distant lands. In Kampen, a shipwright hammered together sturdy vessels designed for the Baltic trade. These were not isolated acts, but parts of a wider web of activity that tied the lives of ordinary people to the currents of international commerce. Festivals, religious processions, and guild celebrations punctuated the year, blending devotion with civic pride. The prosperity of the age gave people the means to invest in homes, tools, and education, laying the foundations for cultural and intellectual growth. By the year 1300, the transformation was undeniable. The Low Countries were no longer a backwater at the edges of Europe. They had become one of its beating hearts, a place where wealth flowed, where towns demanded freedom, where lords balanced power with burghers, and where merchants looked beyond the horizon to distant markets. The legacy of this era was profound. It created a society that valued commerce, independence, and cooperation. The foundations laid in the High Middle Ages would endure, shaping the destiny of the Netherlands for centuries. Yet even as prosperity flourished, tension brewed beneath the surface. The wealth of the towns drew envy from kings. The autonomy of burghers challenged the authority of lords, and the fragile balance between power and freedom was always at risk of collapse. The story of the Low Countries was only beginning, but by 1300 its path was already set on a course toward greatness and struggle alike. The 14th century opened with the Low Countries already brimming with energy. Its towns thrived, its merchants prospered, and its fields yielded the fruits of careful labor and water management. Yet politically the land remained fragmented. Flanders, Brabant, Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, and many smaller lordships all pursued their own paths, often clashing with one another and with the great powers around them. The French crown eyed the wealth of Flanders hungrily. The Holy Roman Emperors claimed suzerainty, but struggled to enforce their authority. Local counts and dukes ruled with pride, but none could command the whole of the Low Countries. This landscape of division was about to change with the rise of an unexpected power, the Dukes of Burgundy. The Burgundians were outsiders, at first princes of a French duchy far to the south. Yet through shrewd marriages and calculated ambition, they extended their reach into the Low Countries. The turning point came in 1384, when Philip the Bold, son of the King of France, married Margaret of Flanders, heiress to the counties of Flanders, Artois, Rethel, and Franche. With this union, the Burgundian dynasty gained a foothold in the richest part of northern Europe. From there, generation by generation, the dukes expanded their domain until most of the Dutch provinces fell under their authority. The Burgundian dukes were not content to be mere lords of scattered territories. They dreamed of forging a great principality that could stand independent between France and the Empire. To achieve this, they sought to bind their diverse lands together, not only by force but by culture, ceremony, and administration. Their courts glittered with magnificence. Philip the Good, who reigned from 1419 to 1467, epitomized this grandeur. His court at Bruges and later Brussels became one of the most splendid in Europe. Tapestries, jewels, silks, and feasts dazzled visitors. Chroniclers wrote admiringly of his retinue of knights, courtiers, and artists. Through pageantry, Philip projected an image of unity, as though all the provinces of the Low Countries formed a single realm beneath his mantle. The dukes relied heavily on the wealth of the towns to finance this magnificence. Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, Brussels, Antwerp, these cities were treasure houses of Europe. The cloth industry flourished, fed by English wool and sold across the continent. Merchants traded not only in cloth but in spices, wines, metals, and luxury goods. Antwerp, in particular, began its rise as a commercial hub, its river port on the Scheldt offering access to the heart of Europe. Markets swelled with goods from Italy and Spain, while German merchants of the Hanseatic League maintained their warehouses. The prosperity of the towns provided the dukes with taxes, loans, and legitimacy, but also with challenges, for urban independence remained strong. Culture blossomed in this environment of wealth and princely patronage. The Burgundian court became a beacon of art and music. The dukes commissioned illuminated manuscripts of unparalleled beauty, their pages alive with gold leaf and miniature scenes of courtly life. Painters such as Jan van Eyck found patronage here, his mastery of oil painting revolutionizing European art with a realism that captured light, texture, and human expression in unprecedented ways. In music, the Burgundian chapel nurtured composers like Guillaume de Fay, whose polyphonic masses and motets filled cathedrals with intricate harmony. The influence of the Renaissance, stirring first in Italy, began to seep northward through trade routes and cultural exchange. In the cities of the Low Countries, one could see the first signs of that rebirth: humanist scholars, architects experimenting with classical forms, and merchants commissioning works that blended devotion with worldly pride. Yet this age of magnificence and culture was also marked by tension. The towns, fiercely protective of their privileges, often resisted Burgundian authority. In Ghent, the guilds guarded their independence with defiance, unwilling to submit meekly to ducal demands. The Great Revolt of Ghent in the 1440s illustrated this conflict. When Philip the Good sought to impose heavier taxes, the city rose in rebellion, mustering thousands of men-at-arms and drawing other towns into the struggle. For years, conflict raged between ducal forces and the militias of Ghent, until at last Philip triumphed. His victory was decisive, yet it came at great cost. The revolt revealed the precarious balance between princely power and urban freedom in the Low Countries. Other towns too clashed with the dukes. Bruges, once the jewel of commerce, entered into decline after disputes with foreign merchants and competition from nearby Antwerp. Its citizens rioted when they felt their liberties threatened, forcing the dukes to tread carefully. Even as they dreamed of unity, the Burgundians could not ignore the stubborn independence of their towns. Administration was another tool the dukes used to bind their lands together. They established the States General, an assembly bringing together representatives of different provinces to discuss taxation and policy. Though initially meant to serve ducal interests, this body planted the seeds of a broader political consciousness. For the first time, the provinces of the Low Countries deliberated together, however reluctantly, about their common concerns. In time, this institution would play a crucial role in shaping the destiny of the Netherlands. The Burgundian experiment reached its height under Charles the Bold, who inherited his father Philip's ambitions and expanded them with reckless energy. He sought not only to unite the Low Countries, but to carve out a kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Alps. His wars against France and the Swiss consumed vast resources, drawing heavily on the wealth of his towns. Yet his dreams outran his grasp. In 1477, at the Battle of Nancy, Charles fell in combat, his body left frozen in the snow. With his death, the grand vision of a Burgundian kingdom collapsed. Yet the legacy of the Burgundian age endured. By bringing the provinces together under one dynasty, the dukes had sown the idea of unity. Their courts had fostered a cultural flowering that made the Low Countries renowned across Europe. Their struggles with the towns had sharpened the sense of civic identity and the defense of liberty. Out of magnificence and conflict alike, a new chapter in the history of the Netherlands was forged, one that would soon pass into the hands of the Habsburgs, and with them into the crucible of empire and rebellion. By the 14th century, the Low Countries stood at a crossroads. Their towns had grown into some of the richest and most vibrant in all Europe. Yet politically, the land remained fragmented into counties, duchies, and bishoprics, each with its own traditions, privileges, and ambitions. Flanders, Brabant, Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht shared geography and commerce, but were divided by rivalries. France and the Holy Roman Empire both claimed influence, yet neither held true control. Out of this fractured landscape emerged a new dynasty, an unlikely one from Burgundy, that would attempt what no count or duke before had managed: the unification of the provinces under a single princely hand. The story began in 1384, when Philip the Bold of Burgundy married Margaret of Flanders, the wealthy heiress of Louis of Maille. Through this union, the Dukes of Burgundy inherited not only Flanders but Artois, Rethel, and Franche-Comté. What had seemed a distant branch of the French royal house suddenly possessed lands among the most prosperous of the north. Over the next century, successive dukes used marriage, inheritance, and conquest to expand their dominion. John the Fearless secured Brabant. Philip the Good added Holland, Zeeland, and Hainaut. By the mid-15th century, nearly all the provinces of the Low Countries had fallen beneath Burgundian authority. The dukes sought not only to collect titles, but to weave their patchwork of territories into something greater. At their courts, in Dijon, Bruges, Brussels, and later Mechelen, they displayed a magnificence that astonished contemporaries. Philip the Good, the most celebrated of them, presided over a court of splendor rivaling that of kings. Tapestries depicting biblical scenes and Burgundian triumphs draped his halls. Banquets overflowed with delicacies: roasted peacocks adorned with gilded feathers, imported wines from Gascony, spices from the Levant. Knights paraded in tournaments, their armor gleaming, while poets and chroniclers extolled the glory of the House of Burgundy. These spectacles were more than vanity. They projected an image of unity, binding the diverse provinces through shared pageantry and loyalty to the Duke. The wealth that sustained such magnificence came above all from the towns. Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, and later Antwerp were not mere provincial centers. They were international crossroads of commerce. The wool of England arrived at their docks to be woven into fine cloth by Flemish artisans. Italian merchants carried spices, silks, and dyes northward, while Hanseatic traders brought grain, fish, and timber from the Baltic. Markets thrummed with the hum of many tongues: Dutch, French, German, Italian, English. The urban population swelled, drawn by the promise of work and freedom. Guilds flourished, regulating trades from weaving to brewing, each jealously guarding its privileges. A master weaver in Ghent might command the labor of dozens of apprentices, his cloth fetching a price in the courts of Florence or Milan. In Antwerp, bankers and money changers exchanged currencies from across Europe, making the city a financial hub. Culture flowered in this soil of wealth and princely patronage. The Burgundian dukes became famed as patrons of the arts, nurturing a cultural golden age. Painters like Jan van Eyck, Rogier van der Weyden, and Hans Memling transformed visual art with their mastery of oil painting, capturing the sheen of jewels, the texture of fabrics, and the subtleties of human emotion with a realism that astonished their contemporaries. Illuminated manuscripts, adorned with radiant colors and delicate miniatures, circulated through courtly and clerical circles. Music, too, reached new heights. The Burgundian chapel cultivated composers such as Guillaume de Fay and Guillaume, whose polyphonic works echoed through cathedrals and chapels, filling sacred spaces with harmonies that seemed almost celestial. The early Renaissance, born in Italy, made its way north along the trade routes, blending with local traditions to create something distinctively Humanist scholars began to appear in university towns, reading classical texts and challenging old ways of thought, setting the stage for intellectual transformations to come. But prosperity and culture did not erase the old tensions between towns and nobility. The cities had long defended their liberties, and they did not yield them easily to Burgundian centralization. Ghent was the most defiant. In the 1440s, when Philip the Good attempted to impose heavier taxes to fund his wars against England and France, the city rose in open revolt. Guild militias took to the streets, bells summoned citizens to arms, and banners bearing the White Lion of Ghent waved defiantly against ducal troops. The struggle dragged on for years, with sieges, skirmishes, and shifting alliances. At last, Philip crushed the rebellion, entering Ghent in triumph. Yet even in victory, he recognized that the towns could not be ruled like villages. Their wealth and manpower made them indispensable, and so the uneasy dance between ducal authority and urban liberty continued. Bruges, too, challenged the dukes. Its prosperity began to falter as its waterways silted, limiting access for large sea-going vessels. When foreign merchants, especially from the Hanseatic League, shifted their business to Antwerp, Bruges burghers rioted, protesting ducal interference and demanding the protection of their privileges. The dukes responded with a mix of force and concession, ever aware that suppressing a city too harshly risked losing the lifeblood of their realm. Antwerp, rising on the Scheldt, soon eclipsed Bruges as the great emporium of the north, its broad river welcoming ships from England, Iberia, and Italy. By 1500, Antwerp had become a city of staggering dynamism, the marketplace of Europe. Administratively, the Burgundian dukes sought to bind their provinces together with new institutions. They created central councils to oversee finances and justice. Most importantly, they summoned representatives from across the Low Countries to a body known as the States General. At first, this assembly served the dukes' needs, particularly in approving taxes, yet it planted the seeds of something greater, a political forum where the provinces could recognize common interests. Over time, the idea of collective identity, of being part of a wider Low Country community, took root, however fragile. The climax of the Burgundian era came under Charles the Bold, who inherited his father Philip's ambitions and magnified them with restless energy. Charles dreamed of forging a kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, a realm to rival France itself. He waged war against neighbors, invested in massive armies, and demanded ever more from his towns. His authoritarian style strained the delicate balance between princely ambition and urban autonomy. In 1477, his dreams collapsed at the Battle of Nancy, where he was slain fighting the Swiss. His body, found battered and frozen, symbolized the end of Burgundian grandeur. Yet the death of Charles did not erase the Burgundian legacy. His daughter, Mary of Burgundy, inherited the vast domains, though they soon passed into the hands of the Habsburgs through her marriage to Maximilian of Austria. Still, the century of Burgundian rule had left an indelible imprint. The provinces, once divided, had been brought under a single princely house. Their towns had experienced both the burden and the patronage of ducal rule. Their culture had blossomed into one of Europe's most dazzling, and their political institutions, born of conflict between dukes and burghers, hinted at the struggles for liberty that would one day define the Netherlands. By 1500, the Burgundian Netherlands stood as one of the most prosperous and cultured regions of Europe. Its merchants traded across the known world. Its artists shaped the course of Western painting. Its towns jealously defended their freedoms, even against the mightiest dukes. The Burgundians had sought to create a great northern kingdom, and though their dynasty ended in tragedy, the foundations they laid would shape the destiny of the Low Countries for centuries to come. When Charles of Habsburg was born in Ghent in 1500, few could have imagined that this infant, cradled in a Flemish town, would one day become the most powerful monarch in Europe. He was the grandson of Mary of Burgundy, whose marriage to Maximilian of Austria had passed the Burgundian inheritance into Habsburg hands. Through a web of marriages and inheritances, Charles grew to rule an empire upon which the sun truly never set. From the silver mines of the New World to the Italian states, from Spain to the Holy Roman Empire, and at the very heart of his dominion, the wealthy, quarrelsome, and restless provinces of the Low Countries. The Netherlands held a special place in Charles's heart. Unlike Spain or Austria, these lands were his birthplace. He spoke their languages, walked their streets, and knew their people. He recognized the wealth of the town's Antwerp's bustling markets, Bruges, guildhalls, Ghent's workshops, Amsterdam's growing portas, the economic engine of his empire. Yet ruling the Netherlands was never simple. Their traditions of local autonomy, their jealous defense of urban privileges, and their deep-rooted liberties stood uneasily beside the centralizing ambitions of a monarch who was also emperor. Charles governed the Netherlands through a system of governors and councils, often appointing members of his own family to oversee affairs. He created a more unified administrative framework, grouping the provinces into what came to be known as the 17 provinces. His aim was to knit together the patchwork inheritance of Burgundian and feudal lordships into a coherent political unit under Habsburg authority. He also sought to defend his territories against foreign threats, particularly France, which pressed constantly upon the borders. The Netherlands paid heavily for these wars, as taxes were raised and loans demanded to finance armies that marched far beyond their own frontiers. Still, during Charles's reign, the Netherlands enjoyed prosperity. Antwerp rose to dominance as the great market of Europe. Its exchange became the beating heart of international commerce. Portuguese ships unloaded spices from Asia. Italian bankers managed credit and finance. English merchants brought wool. German traders delivered metals and timber. Goods from the New World, sugar, silver, and tobacco passed through Antwerp's warehouses, making the city a cosmopolitan hub where dozens of languages mingled in the marketplace. The wealth of Antwerp was dazzling, but it also made the Netherlands indispensable to Charles, who relied on its riches to sustain his far-flung empire. Yet beneath this prosperity, seeds of discord began to sprout. The early 16th century saw the tremors of a religious earthquake shaking Europe. The Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther had nailed his theses to a church door in Wittenberg, challenging the authority of Rome. His words spread like wildfire across Germany and into the Low Countries, carried by students, merchants, and printers. The Netherlands, with its literacy, printing presses, and trading connections, became fertile ground for reform. Preachers denounced indulgences, mocked clerical corruption, and called for a return to the Bible as the true source of faith. Charles V, though a son of the Netherlands, was also a staunch Catholic emperor. He could not tolerate heresy within his dominions, especially so close to the heart of Christendom. Edicts were issued condemning Protestant teachings, heretical books were banned, and inquisitors hunted dissenters. Those who persisted were tried, and many burned at the stake in town squares, a grim warning to others. Yet repression only spread the message further. Secret gatherings known as conventicles took place in fields and barns, where men and women read forbidden scriptures and sang psalms in defiance of authority. Lutheranism, Anabaptism, and later Calvinism found adherents in towns and countryside alike. The movement was not uniform, some sought only reform of abuses. Others demanded a complete break with Rome, but all challenged the unity of faith that Charles sought to defend. By mid-century, the Netherlands stood divided. On one hand, its cities prospered as never before. Their markets thronged with goods from across the world. On the other, its people wrestled with questions of conscience, faith, and loyalty. Charles, wearied by decades of struggle, abdicated in 1555 in a dramatic ceremony in Brussels. He leaned on the shoulder of his son Philip and spoke to the assembled nobles of his labors and his failures. Then he withdrew, retiring to a monastery in Spain. The Netherlands, along with Spain, Italy, and the overseas empire, passed into the hands of Philip II. Philip II was unlike his father in every way. Where Charles had been cosmopolitan, familiar with the Netherlands and their ways, Philip was Spanish to the core. He spoke little Dutch, cared little for local liberties, and ruled from afar with a rigid Catholic zeal. To him, the Netherlands were a source of revenue and a front line in the battle for the soul of Europe. He saw heresy not as a nuisance, but as a mortal threat to the order of Christendom. Philip's policies quickly deepened tensions. He strengthened the Inquisition, appointing bishops loyal to Rome and to himself. He demanded higher taxes to fund wars against France and the Ottoman Turks. He placed Spanish officials and soldiers in positions of authority, provoking resentment from the local nobility in towns, who saw their traditions of self-rule undermined. The nobles, long accustomed to advising their ruler, found themselves sidelined by Philip's centralized governance. The towns, proud of their charters and privileges, bristled at foreign interference. Meanwhile, the Protestant movement grew bolder. Calvinism, with its emphasis on discipline, simplicity, and community, spread rapidly through the cities. It found particular strength among artisans and merchants, men and women who valued its directness and its defiance of clerical pomp. Public psalm-singing became an act of resistance. Underground presses produced tracts and Bibles, smuggled across borders despite the risk of death. By the 1560s, the conflict between Catholic Spain and the Dutch provinces reached a breaking point. Nobles, such as William of Orange, Lamoral of Egmont, and Philip of Montmorency, began to voice opposition to Philip's harsh policies. Petitions were sent to the king, pleading for moderation, for tolerance, for respect of local liberties. Philip, from his distant court in Madrid, remained unmoved. To him, compromise with heresy was betrayal. In 1566, the discontent boiled over in what became known as the iconoclastic fury across the Netherlands. Calvinist crowds stormed churches, smashing statues, tearing down altars, shattering stained glass, and stripping sanctuaries of ornament. To the faithful, these were acts of purification, a rejection of idolatry. To Catholics, they were acts of desecration, an insult to centuries of devotion. To Philip, they were outright rebellion. His response was swift and merciless. He dispatched the Duke of Alba, a hardened general, at the head of a Spanish army to restore order. The arrival of Alba in 1567 marked the end of any fragile peace. He established the Council of Troubles, soon known as the Council of Blood, which condemned thousands to death, confiscated lands, and terrorized the provinces into submission. Nobles such as Egmont and Hoorn were executed, their deaths sending shockwaves through the Netherlands. Fear and anger mingled in the streets. William of Orange fled, but he would soon return at the head of resistance. The repression failed to silence dissent. Instead, it pushed the provinces toward open rebellion. By 1568, the stage was set for a conflict that would engulf the Netherlands for 80 years. The wealthiest provinces of Europe, birthplace of emperors and jewel of the Habsburg crown, now stood on the edge of revolt against the mightiest king of Christendom. The long struggle for independence, faith, and liberty had begun. The year 1568 is often remembered as the spark that ignited the long Dutch revolt. The arrival of the Duke of Alba with his hardened Spanish troops had driven the provinces into fear and fury. His Council of Blood condemned thousands, his soldiers enforced obedience, and his taxes drained the wealth of towns already burdened by trade disruptions. But repression breeds resistance, and from the shadows emerged a leader, William of Orange, later known as William the Silent. William had once been a loyal servant of the Habsburgs, favored by Charles V himself. He held lands, titles, and influence, yet he became disillusioned under Philip II's harsh rule. He was cautious by nature, careful with words, hence the nickname, the Silent. But behind this restraint lay a determined vision, that the provinces of the Netherlands should preserve their ancient liberties and be free from foreign tyranny. He fled exile, raised forces, and began to rally nobles, towns, and Calvinist communities against Spanish oppression. The first campaigns were hesitant. In 1568, William and his brothers launched incursions, hoping to spark widespread uprising. At Heiligerlee, his brother Louis of Nassau won a small but symbolic victory against the Spanish, though another brother, Adolf, was killed. This battle marked the beginning of open war. Yet soon after, Alba crushed the rebel army at Gemmingen, slaughtering thousands. William's resources dwindled, his allies faltered, and for a time it seemed the revolt might collapse. But the spirit of resistance could not be stamped out. Rebellion smoldered not only on the battlefield, but also at sea. Bands of Calvinist privateers, known as the Sea Beggars, roamed the coasts, attacking Spanish shipping. In 1572, they seized the town of Brielle, a seemingly small event that proved decisive. The capture inspired a wave of uprisings across Holland and Zeeland, where towns declared for William. From then on, the revolt spread like wildfire, and the war entered a new and relentless phase. Spanish repression grew harsher still. Alba imposed a 10th penny tax, enraging merchants already weary of war. He garrisoned soldiers in towns, sparking resentment and riots. His brutality earned him hatred, not only among rebels but also among moderate Catholics and nobles. The Netherlands, once divided by religion and regional identity, found in Alba's iron fist a common enemy. Eventually, his failures forced Philip to recall him, but the scars he left could not be undone. The struggle ebbed and flowed for decades. Spanish armies, among the finest in Europe, besieged rebellious cities with grim determination. Town after town endured starvation, bombardment, and massacre. In 1574, the city of Leiden withstood a desperate siege, its inhabitants reduced to eating dogs, cats, and leather. When all seemed lost, Dutch forces cut the dikes and flooded the surrounding land, sailing ships into the fields to drive the Spanish away. Leiden survived, and in gratitude, William founded a university, Leiden University, which became a beacon of learning for the new republic. Meanwhile, the conflict widened. In 1576, unpaid Spanish soldiers mutinied, sacking Antwerp in a night of terror known as the Spanish Fury. Thousands were killed, the great city ravaged. The horror shocked Europe and pushed the provinces closer together. The pacification of Ghent followed, a rare moment of unity between Catholic and Protestant provinces, agreeing to expel foreign troops and restore liberties. But unity was fragile. Religious divisions remained, and Philip II was relentless. New Spanish commanders arrived, among them Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, a gifted general and diplomat. Parma combined military skill with shrewd negotiation, winning back many southern provinces to loyalty through promises and persuasion. By the 1580s, the Low Countries were effectively split. The Protestant north, centered in Holland and Zeeland, persisted in revolt, while the largely Catholic South Flanders and Brabantry turned to Spanish allegiance. This division would shape the map of Europe, laying the foundations for what would become Belgium and the Netherlands. In the north, resistance hardened. In 1581, the provinces issued the Act of Abjuration, a bold declaration rejecting Philip II as their sovereign. It was a revolutionary document, echoing the idea that a ruler who oppresses his people loses the right to rule. Yet leadership remained uncertain. William of Orange continued to guide the cause, but in 1584 he was assassinated in Delft by a Catholic zealot. His death was a heavy blow, yet his legacy endured. His son Maurice of Nassau took up command and, with brilliant military reforms, carried the revolt forward. Maurice, trained in mathematics and engineering, transformed Dutch warfare. He pioneered new siege techniques, drilled his troops with precision, and emphasized discipline. Under his leadership, the Dutch scored victories that gave them breathing room. Capturing key towns and pushing back the Spanish, he was aided by the growing wealth of the provinces. Trade continued to flourish despite war, with Amsterdam rising as a new center of commerce after Antwerp's decline. Ships from the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and soon from Asia and the Americas poured riches into the northern ports, funding the war effort. The struggle was long and grinding, often more about sieges than pitched battles. Spain, though mighty, was stretched thin. Wars in France, rebellion in Portugal, the Armada against England all drained its strength. The Dutch, though small, proved resilient, their waterways and fortresses difficult to conquer. They received support from Protestant allies abroad, particularly England, where Queen Elizabeth I sent troops and aid to check Spanish power. Gradually, the tide turned. By the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic had established itself de facto in the north. The Union of Utrecht provided a political framework, binding provinces together while preserving local autonomy. The Republic was unusual, a federation without a king, governed by states and merchants rather than monarchs. It was fragile, often divided, yet remarkably successful. In 1609, after decades of bloodshed, the 12 Years' Truce was signed. Though temporary, it acknowledged the reality of Dutch independence in practice. During this pause, the Dutch expanded overseas, founding the East India Company and beginning their colonial empire. Trade flourished, art and science blossomed, and the Republic began its golden age. But the war was not over. Hostilities resumed in 1621, as Philip III of Spain and later his successors sought to reclaim the rebellious provinces. The conflict merged with the wider 30 Years' War that consumed Europe. Battles raged from the Rhineland to the seas, as Dutch fleets challenged Spanish and Portuguese power abroad. Despite setbacks, the Republic endured. At last, after 80 years of intermittent struggle, diplomacy prevailed. In 1648, at the Treaty of Westphalia, Spain formally recognized the independence of the United Provinces. The war that had begun with William of Orange's revolt and Alba's repression ended with the birth of a new state. The Dutch Republic stood free, its independence secured, not by royal decree, but by decades of sacrifice, resilience, and determination. The conclusion of the war was more than a victory for the Netherlands. It was a milestone in European history. The recognition of a small federation of provinces as a sovereign state, the triumph of a people over empire, and the dawn of a republic that would soon dominate the seas trade and culture of the 17th century. As the 12 Years' Truce expired in 1621, the guns of war roared once more across the Netherlands. Spain, under Philip IV, hoped to regain its rebellious provinces, while the Dutch, now more confident and wealthy than ever, prepared to defend their fragile republic. The struggle blended into the larger 30 Years' War that engulfed much of Europe. turning the Low Countries once again into a battlefield of empires. Maurice of Nassau's campaigns gave way to the leadership of his half-brother, Frederick Henry, known as the Stadtholder of Orange. Frederick Henry proved a skilled commander and diplomat. Under his guidance, the Dutch armies grew stronger, seizing strategic fortresses and cities from Spanish hands. Towns like Essertugenbosch and Breda fell after carefully orchestrated sieges, victories that boosted Dutch morale and tightened their hold on the north. The Republic's military machine became one of the most modern in Europe, built on discipline, innovation, and the strategic use of water defenses. At sea, the Dutch Navy emerged as a formidable force. Captains such as Piet Eng struck blows against Spain's lifelines, capturing the Spanish treasure fleet in 1628 and pouring silver into the coffers of the Republic. Dutch ships ranged across the globe, challenging Iberian dominance in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The war was no longer only about religion or liberty, it was also about trade, empire, and control of the seas. Yet the conflict dragged on, wearying both sides. Spain, overstretched by wars in Italy, Germany, and against France, found its once unbeatable armies drained and its finances collapsing under the weight of endless campaigns. The Dutch, though prosperous, also longed for peace. The cost of maintaining armies and fleets strained even their booming economy. By the 1640s, both sides realized that the war could not be won outright by force. Diplomats gathered in the Westphalian cities of Munster and Osnabrück, where Europe's great powers sought to end the wider 30 Years' War. For the Dutch, the central demand was clear: recognition of their independence, not as rebels, but as a sovereign republic. Spain resisted, reluctant to surrender its claim to lands that had once been the jewel of its empire. But after 8 decades of rebellion, repression, and resistance, the reality could no longer be denied. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. Spain formally acknowledged the United Provinces as free and independent. The river Scheldt, long contested, was closed to navigation, cementing Amsterdam's dominance as the great commercial port of the north. The Republic secured not only its independence but also international recognition, entering the community of European states on equal footing. For the people of the Netherlands, the moment was bittersweet. The war had scarred generations, cities burned, fields flooded, countless lives lost. Yet from the struggle had arisen a republic unlike any other in Europe, a federation of provinces, governed by merchants, nobles, and statesmen, without a king. Its survival was proof that determination, unity, and ingenuity could defy the mightiest empire of the age. The 80 Years' War had begun as a desperate revolt against tyranny. It ended with the birth of a nation. From that moment forward, the Dutch Republic would step onto the world stage, entering its golden age of trade, science, art, and power. The Treaty of Westphalia was not only the conclusion of war, but the dawn of independence. When peace finally settled over the Low Countries in 1648, the United Provinces stood free, small in territory yet vast in ambition. Their independence, won through 80 years of struggle, unlocked an energy that swept across every corner of Dutch society. Out of the ashes of war rose a republic that would dominate the seas, shape global trade, and nurture a cultural flowering unlike anything Europe had ever seen. The 17th century became known as the Dutch Golden Age. At the heart of this transformation stood Amsterdam. Once a modest fishing town, it has now emerged as the beating heart of world commerce. Its canals bustled with ships from every corner of the globe, hulking East Indiamen returning from Asia with spices and porcelain, sleek flights carrying Baltic grain and timber, Spanish silver flowing in from the New World. Warehouses lined the quays, filled with pepper, nutmeg, silk, and tea, while merchants' mansions rose proudly along the Herengracht and Keizersgracht, testaments to newfound wealth. The key to this prosperity lay in organization and innovation. In 1602, merchants and statesmen had founded the Verenigd Oostindische Company, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. Unlike earlier ventures, this was not a temporary trading partnership, but a permanent joint stock company, backed by investors large and small. Its charter granted it powers usually reserved for states: the right to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. With these tools, the VOC carved out a commercial empire across Asia. From its base at Batavia on the island of Java, the company monopolized the spice trade, seizing control of Clove and Nutmeg Islands in the Moluccas, ousting rivals, and enforcing its rule with fleets and fortresses. Dutch ships sailed as far as Japan, the only Europeans permitted to trade at Nagasaki. They brought back porcelain, lacquerware, and exotic knowledge, feeding Europe's growing curiosity about the wider world. The profits were immense, pouring into Amsterdam's coffers and fueling further expansion. The Dutch were not content with Asia alone. In 1621, the West India Company was founded to challenge Iberian power in the Americas and Africa. It attacked Spanish treasure fleets, seized parts of Brazil, and established forts along the African coast. Dutch merchants traded in sugar, tobacco, and tragically, in enslaved Africans. The Republic's reach extended across oceans, its navy protecting shipping lanes, and its colonies serving as stepping stones in a global web of trade. Back home, Amsterdam became the financial capital of the world. Its stock exchange, founded alongside the VOC, allowed investors to buy and sell shares, pioneering modern capitalism. Banks provided credit, insurance underwrote risky voyages, and fortunes were made on the shifting tides of commerce. Wealth was no longer confined to nobles. Merchants, shipowners, and traders wielded power, shaping the politics of the Republic. Yet the Golden Age was not only about wealth, it was also about culture. Dutch painters captured the world around them with unmatched brilliance. Rembrandt van Rijn, with his mastery of light and shadow, painted portraits that seemed to breathe, biblical scenes filled with humanity, and etchings that revealed the soul of a nation. Johannes Vermeer depicted quiet interiors, where light fell gently on maps, instruments, and women absorbed in daily tasks. Frans Hals immortalized the swagger of civic guardsmen with bold strokes, while landscapes by Jacob van Ruysdael evoked the flat fields, windmills, and skies of the homeland. Art was not confined to courts or churches, as in other countries. In the Dutch Republic, paintings hung in the homes of merchants, bakers, and brewers. Still lifes of cheese, bread, and tulips reflected both prosperity and the fragility of life. This democratization of art was a mirror of the Republic itself, a society where wealth and influence were widely spread, and where culture flourished, not in palaces but in towns and households. Science thrived. The Netherlands became a center of inquiry and discovery. Christian Huygens studied light and invented the pendulum clock, advancing astronomy and timekeeping. Antonieur van Leeuwenhoek, with his handcrafted microscopes, peered into a hidden world of tiny organisms, opening the door to microbiology. Maps, atlases, and globes produced by Dutch cartographers guided sailors across oceans and symbolized the Republic's mastery of navigation and knowledge. Philosophy found fertile ground as well. Baruch Spinoza, a lens grinder in Amsterdam, wrote works that challenged traditional beliefs, laying the foundations for modern rationalism and ideas of tolerance. His thoughts were radical, questioning authority and envisioning a universe governed by reason rather than dogma. Though controversial in his time, his influence would echo across centuries. This golden age was also a paradox. The Republic prided itself on tolerance, granting refuge to Jews expelled from Iberia, to French Huguenots fleeing persecution, to thinkers censored elsewhere. Printing presses produced works in many languages, making Amsterdam a haven of ideas. Yet this tolerance had limits. Religious conflicts simmered between Calvinists and other sects, and political tensions often threatened unity. The wealth of the Republic also rested on systems of exploitation, colonial conquest, monopolies, and the slave trade. The glitter of prosperity was shadowed by suffering in distant lands. Still, to contemporaries, the Dutch Republic seemed a marvel. Here was a small nation, carved from marshes and defended by dikes, that defied kings, humbled empires, and built a global presence. Its ships sailed further, its merchants traded more widely, its artists painted more vividly, and its thinkers questioned more deeply than almost any other people of the age. By the late 1600s, Amsterdam's dominance was unrivaled. The city's population swelled, canals expanded, and wealth displayed itself in architecture, art collections, and learning. The Dutch Golden Age was a testament to what resilience, innovation, and freedom could achieve after generations of struggle. But golden ages are never eternal. Rivals watched with envy, and storms gathered on the horizon. England and France, rising powers, would soon challenge Dutch supremacy. Yet in that century, the Republic shone brighter than almost any state in Europe, a beacon of trade, knowledge, and culture. Its influence carried on the wind of sails to every shore of the world. By the final decades of the 17th century, the Dutch Republic stood at the height of its glory. Amsterdam was the undisputed hub of world commerce, its exchange humming with speculation, its quays lined with ships from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Dutch merchants controlled the flow of Baltic grain, Asian spices, American sugar, and African slaves. The Republic's banking system, its insurers, and its stock market had become the nervous system of global trade. Wealth poured into the provinces, and for a time, it seemed that no rival could challenge their supremacy. This wealth nourished the flowering of Dutch culture. Rembrandt, though he had suffered financial ruin, continued to produce works of haunting depth. His later paintings filled with a quiet spirituality that reflected both triumphs and burdens of the age. Vermeer's small, intimate scenes captured the dignity of everyday life, the serenity of light falling on a woman reading, or the stillness of a quiet street in Delft. Spinoza's ideas spread cautiously but steadily, planting seeds of Enlightenment thought. Scholars, cartographers, and scientists placed the Netherlands at the forefront of European knowledge, from Huygens clocks to Leeuwenhoek's microscopes. Yet even as the Republic glowed in prosperity, shadows lengthened. The very success that had brought such wealth also bred powerful rivals. England, whose navy grew stronger with every year, challenged Dutch control of the seas in brutal wars of the 1650s and 1660s. France, under Louis XIV, threatened Dutch borders with armies far larger than anything the small republic could field. Trade routes became contested, colonies attacked, and the costs of defense strained the resources of even this wealthy state. The Golden Age, then, was not an unbroken triumph. It was a fragile brilliance, constantly tested by war abroad and divisions at home. Religious disputes simmered, political factions clashed between the Republican Party and the supporters of the House of Orange, and ordinary people bore the weight of taxes needed to fund ships and armies. The Dutch had achieved a marvel, a republic that ruled the seas, fostered art, and championed ideas. But the effort to defend this achievement would become ever more difficult as the century closed. Still, the legacy of the Golden Age endured. The canals of Amsterdam, the canvases of Rembrandt and Vermeer, the treatises of Spinoza, and the charts of Dutch navigators testified to an age when a small nation of merchants, sailors, and thinkers shaped the destiny of the wider world. It was an age born of struggle, sustained by daring, and remembered for its brilliance. As the 17th century ended, the Dutch Republic stood proud, aware that storms were gathering, yet secure in the knowledge that its golden age had changed Europe, and indeed the world, forever. The dawn of the 18th century found the Dutch Republic at a crossroads. The canals of Amsterdam still sparkled with ships from distant corners of the world. Warehouses brimmed with spices, silks, and sugar. Bankers counted coins in the exchange, and merchants haggled over cargoes arriving from Asia and the Americas. To a casual observer, it might have seemed as though the Golden Age continued, unbroken and eternal. But beneath the surface, cracks were widening. The Dutch Republic, once the bold pioneer of global trade and naval supremacy, was about to enter a century of struggles, decline, and constant tests of survival. The changing balance of naval power. For decades, the Dutch had prided themselves on their mastery of the seas. Admirals like Mitchell de Ruyter had humiliated the English in daring raids, sailing up the Thames to burn ships in their own harbors. Dutch fleets had once carried more goods than any other in Europe, their merchant navy the backbone of global commerce. But as the 1700s began, the tide turned. England's Royal Navy was growing stronger with every passing year. New shipyards along the Thames produced vessels faster than Dutch yards could manage. The English developed larger warships, with more guns and thicker hulls, while Dutch ships, smaller and built for shallow waters and trade efficiency, could not match them in open battle. France, too, poured resources into its navy under the ambitions of Louis XIV. The Dutch, caught between two giants, suddenly seemed vulnerable. Wars of the early 18th century made this imbalance painfully clear. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, dragged the Dutch into conflict alongside their allies. While they fought bravely, their fleets struggled to keep pace. England emerged from the war not only stronger militarily, but also richer, having seized key territories that boosted its trade routes. The Dutch, meanwhile, had borne heavy costs, losing ships, men, and treasure. At sea, the rivalry became less about daring raids and more about survival. English convoys began to dominate Atlantic trade, while French privateers preyed on Dutch shipping. Insurance rates in Amsterdam soared as merchants calculated the risks of sending ships across dangerous waters. The proud image of the Dutch as rulers of the oceans began to fade. Instead, they became increasingly dependent on alliances and negotiations to protect their trade, an uncomfortable position for a nation that had once dictated the flow of global commerce. Economic decline compared to neighbors. The weakening of naval power fed directly into economic struggles. During the 17th century, Amsterdam had been the beating heart of world finance. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank was the most reliable institution in Europe, and the city's stock market set trends followed from Paris to London. But by the mid-1700s, a shift was underway. London began to eclipse Amsterdam as the hub of finance. England's growing empire brought streams of silver, gold, and commodities, while its banks developed more flexible lending practices. Investors who once looked to Amsterdam now turned their eyes across the channel. The Dutch economy, though still prosperous, seemed increasingly cautious. Merchants preferred safe investments, lending money to foreign governments rather than risking new voyages or daring enterprises. In this way, Dutch capital helped finance the very rivals England and France, who were outpacing them in trade and empire. Industries that had once flourished also struggled. Dutch shipbuilding, famous for its efficiency, now lagged behind English innovations. Textile production faced competition from cheaper English and French cloth. The fisheries of the North Sea, long a steady source of wealth, declined under pressure from new competitors. Even the VOC, mighty Dutch East India Company, showed signs of strain. Corruption seeped into its ranks, and competition from English and French companies eroded its monopoly. Profits shrank, and fewer spices reached the quays of Amsterdam. In the provinces, ordinary people felt the pinch. Taxes were high, needed to fund defenses against powerful neighbors. The cost of living rose, while wages stagnated. Wealthy merchants and regents still lived comfortably in their canal houses, but the gap between rich and poor widened. A sense of decline, subtle at first, but unmistakable, settled over the Republic. Internal political struggles, Orangists versus Republicans. As external challenges mounted, internal divisions deepened. The Dutch Republic had always been in uneasy balance between the Republican regents, who governed the provinces, and the House of Orange, whose princes embodied leadership in times of war. In the 17th century, this balance had brought moments of both strength and conflict. In the 18th century, it became a dangerous weakness. The Republicans' wealthy urban regions favored cautious policies. They sought peace, careful diplomacy, and limited spending. Their power lay in the cities, especially Holland, the wealthiest province. The Orangists, by contrast, rallied around the Princes of Orange, arguing that strong, decisive leadership was needed to face threats from France and England. Their support came from rural areas, the military, and many ordinary citizens who saw the princes as defenders of national honor. This rivalry erupted repeatedly. During crises, calls for the return of a stadtholder, the head of the House of Orange, would grow louder. When peace returned, the regents sought to limit the power of the Orange family. The back and forth left the Republic unstable, unable to form consistent policies. Instead of unity, the Dutch faced the century divided. The 1740s brought one of the most dramatic moments of this struggle. The War of the Austrian Succession 1740 to 1748 left the Dutch vulnerable to French invasion. Panic spread, and the people demanded leadership. William IV of Orange was made stadtholder of all provinces, breaking the old pattern where some provinces resisted Orange rule. For a moment, it seemed as though the Republic might find stability. But William IV died young, and his son William V inherited the position as a child. Once again, power fell into the hands of regents and advisors, and divisions deepened. By the late 18th century, discontent boiled over. Critics accused the regents of corruption and the Orangists of incompetence. New political movements, inspired by Enlightenment ideas, called for reform. The Republic seemed trapped between its glorious past and an uncertain future, unable to move decisively in either direction. The weight of decline. The 18th century was not marked by a sudden collapse. The Dutch Republic remained relatively wealthy, its cities prosperous, its culture alive. But compared to the dazzling heights of the Golden Age, the difference was stark. Where once the Republic had led, it now followed. Where once its ships commanded the seas, now they sailed under threat. Where once its politics had been bold, now they seemed paralyzed by division. Foreign travelers noticed the change. They admired the canals of Amsterdam, the paintings in Delft, the markets of Rotterdam, but they also sensed a nation past its prime. England and France now set the course of Europe's future. The Dutch, though still respected, had become cautious observers rather than daring leaders. By the end of the century, as revolutions stirred in America and France, the Dutch Republic faced storms it could not avoid. The struggles of the 1700s had weakened its foundations, leaving it vulnerable to the upheavals of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The era of decline, though quieter than the wars of independence or the glory of the Golden Age, was no less decisive. It marked the transition of the Netherlands from a global superpower to a smaller nation struggling to define its place in a rapidly changing world. By the closing decades of the 18th century, the Dutch Republic stood at a crossroads it could no longer avoid. The once proud fleets that had terrorized England and France were now shadows of their former glory. Outnumbered and outgunned, Amsterdam's exchange still echoed with the chatter of merchants. But London's markets had overtaken it, and Paris was shaping the political currents of the continent. Even the great VOC, symbol of Dutch daring in the East, limped into decline, its debts mounting, its authority challenged both abroad and at home. Yet perhaps the deepest wound came not from enemies beyond the borders, but from divisions within. Orangists and Republicans hurled accusations, each blaming the other for weakness and mismanagement. Reformers demanded change, inspired by Enlightenment ideals of liberty and representation, while conservative regents clung to their privileges. The Republic was trapped in a cycle of argument and hesitation, unable to meet the scale of the challenges pressing in from all sides. In this atmosphere of stagnation, frustration, and unrest, the Dutch Republic's decline became undeniable. It remained wealthy compared to many of its neighbors, but the sense of being Europe's leading power, of setting the pace of trade, finance, and politics, had slipped away. Now the Dutch were reactive, responding to the moves of greater powers rather than making bold moves of their own. As the century drew to a close, storms gathered on the horizon. Across the Atlantic, the American Revolution had shown that empires could be broken. In France, revolution would soon sweep away the monarchy, sending shockwaves through every European state. The Dutch, weakened and divided, would not be spared. The 18th century had been an age of slow erosion, the wearing down of greatness. What came next would be far more dramatic, a revolutionary upheaval that would shake the Netherlands to its core. As the 18th century drew to a close, the Dutch Republic was no longer the formidable power it had once been. The canals of Amsterdam were still busy, ships still carried goods across the seas, and the name of the Dutch East India Company VOC still echoed around the world. Yet, beneath the surface, the glory of the Golden Age had faded. The Republic struggled against the rising might of England and France. Its economy was stagnant, and political life was fractured between the Orangists and the Republicans. Then, across the border in France, the world shifted. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, sending shockwaves throughout Europe. Kings and nobles trembled, but reformers and radicals were inspired. In the Netherlands, too, there were many who looked to Paris and saw a vision of change. The Patriot movement, those who had long opposed the dominance of the House of Orange and the entrenched power of wealthy regents, found fresh energy in revolutionary ideas. By the early 1790s, war spread across Europe. Revolutionary France, defiant against the monarchies that sought to crush it, sent armies marching across the continent. The Dutch Republic, allied with Britain and Austria, soon found itself in France's path. The aging institutions of the Republic could not withstand the storm that was coming. In the harsh winter of 1794 to 1795, French revolutionary armies advanced northward. Rivers that usually served as natural barriers froze solid, allowing troops and artillery to march directly over them. The Dutch defenses crumbled. The French were not met only as conquerors. Many patriots within the Netherlands welcomed them as liberators who would sweep away the old regime. In January 1795, Stadtholder William V of Orange fled The Hague, seeking refuge in England. His departure marked the end of the Dutch Republic as it had existed since the 16th century. In its place, under French guidance and with Patriots' support, a new state was proclaimed, the Batavian Republic. For some, it was a moment of hope. The Batavian Republic promised modern reforms, equality before the law, centralized administration, and an end to the privileges that had long protected wealthy regent families. The dream was to build a republic modeled on French revolutionary ideals, yet rooted in Dutch traditions. But from the very beginning, there was an unshakable truth. The Batavian Republic was dependent on France. French troops occupied Dutch cities, French generals dictated military policy, and French diplomats guided foreign affairs. Though it bore the name Republic, it was in reality a satellite of revolutionary France. The Batavian Republic was a laboratory of political change. Over the next decade, the Dutch experimented with constitutions, assemblies, and new systems of government. Enlightenment thinkers influenced laws, and efforts were made to modernize education, justice, and taxation. For ordinary citizens, there was a sense of both possibility and disruption. One of the most symbolic transformations was the end of the Dutch East India Company. Once the engine of Dutch global power, the VOC had been in decline for decades, plagued by corruption, inefficiency, and fierce competition from England. By 1799, its debts were so overwhelming that it was dissolved. Its colonies and possessions once ruled by merchants passed directly into the hands of the Batavian state. Though in practice, France often pulled the strings. Economically, however, the Batavian Republic struggled. The wars of the French Republic against Britain closed off vital trade routes. The British Navy dominated the seas, blockading Dutch ports and seizing ships. Amsterdam, once the financial heart of Europe, lost ground to London. Merchants grew cautious, unemployment rose, and poverty deepened. Politically, divisions remained sharp. Patriots wanted sweeping reforms, while moderates feared instability. Some dreamed of true democracy, others wanted only a more efficient version of the old republic. The French, impatient with Dutch quarrels, frequently intervened, rewriting constitutions and pressuring the Batavian government to support French wars. For ordinary Dutch families, the reality of life under the Batavian Republic was mixed. Taxes were heavy, trade was restricted, and young men were conscripted to fight in France's wars. Yet some welcomed the end of aristocratic privileges and the promise of a fairer society. It was an era of hope and hardship, progress and dependence. By the early 1800s, the French Revolution had given way to the rise of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. First a general, then first consul, and finally emperor, Napoleon sought to reorganize Europe under his rule. For him, the Batavian Republic was too unstable, too divided, and too unreliable. He wanted firm control over the Netherlands, both for its strategic location and its resources. In 1806, Napoleon dissolved the Batavian Republic and created the Kingdom of Holland. He placed his younger brother, Louis Bonaparte, on the throne as king. Louis was not the ruler his brother expected. While Napoleon wanted a puppet, Louis took his duties seriously. He tried to learn Dutch, adopted Dutch customs, and genuinely cared for the welfare of his subjects. During times of disasters such as floods, he personally visited affected areas and offered aid. Many Dutch citizens warmed to him, seeing him as a compassionate king in contrast to his domineering brother. But Louis's independence frustrated Napoleon. Louis resisted sending too many Dutch soldiers to fight in French campaigns, and he opposed the heavy taxes Napoleon demanded. Most importantly, he refused to fully enforce the continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade designed to cut Britain off from European markets. The Dutch, with their long tradition of trade, quietly resisted such restrictions, and smuggling flourished. Napoleon's patience snapped. In 1810, he forced Louis to abdicate and annexed the Netherlands directly into the French Empire. The Dutch were no longer ruled by a local king. They were now French subjects. The annexation brought hardships. Heavy taxes drained Dutch resources to fuel Napoleon's endless wars. Conscription sent thousands of young Dutchmen into the French army, where many perished in distant campaigns. The continental system strangled trade, devastating Amsterdam and other port cities. Resistance grew quietly. Merchants resented the loss of commerce, families mourned their sons, and resentment toward French officials deepened. Yet open rebellion was impossible under Napoleon's watchful eye. The Dutch endured, waiting for the tide to turn. That tide came with Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. The Grande Armée suffered catastrophic losses, and for the first time, Napoleon's power faltered. Defeat at Leipzig in 1813 further weakened French control. As French forces retreated, Dutch patriots seized their chance. In November 1813, Dutch leaders declared independence from France. They invited William Frederick, son of William V of Orange, to return from exile. Landing at Scheveningen, William was greeted as a savior. The people, weary of foreign domination, welcomed the restoration of Dutch leadership. William was proclaimed sovereign prince of the Netherlands. The fall of Napoleon in 1814 to 1815 reshaped Europe. At the Congress of Vienna, the great powers Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia redrew the map to restore stability. For the Netherlands, this meant more than simple independence. The diplomats of Vienna believed that France needed to be contained. To create a strong buffer on its northern border, they decided to unite the former Dutch Republic with the Austrian Netherlands, roughly present-day Belgium and Luxembourg. Together, these territories formed the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. In 1815, William Frederick accepted the crown as King William I for the first time. The Netherlands was a kingdom, not a republic. Its territory was larger than ever before, stretching from the North Sea deep into modern-day Belgium and Luxembourg. This new state held promise but also challenges. The North and South had different languages, religions, and traditions. The Dutch were largely Protestant and Dutch-speaking, while the southern provinces were mostly Catholic and French-speaking. Though united for strategic reasons, these differences would soon cause tensions. Still, for the Dutch, the creation of the kingdom marked a rebirth. After decades of decline, occupation, and foreign domination, they had reclaimed their independence and secured a place in the new Europe. The years from 1795 to 1815 were some of the most turbulent in Dutch history. In just 2 decades, the nation had fallen to invasion, experimented with revolutionary government, endured French annexation, and then re-emerged as a kingdom. It was a story of hardship and resilience, of dependence and survival. The old Dutch Republic was gone, swept away by revolution and war. In its place stood a new monarchy, born not only from Dutch efforts but also from the decisions of Europe's great powers. The Netherlands would never again dominate the seas, as in the Golden Age, but it would endure as an independent nation, shaped by the trials of the Napoleonic era. As the 19th century began, the Dutch people faced new challenges, building a modern state, navigating industrial change, and resolving the deep divisions within their expanded kingdom. But one truth was clear after 20 years of upheaval. The Netherlands had survived, and survival itself was a victory. The dawn of the 19th century found the Netherlands in a new form, reshaped by the Congress of Vienna into the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. The idea behind this union was simple: create a strong buffer state to guard against future French aggression. To achieve this, the Dutch Republic joined with the Austrian Netherlands, what is now Belgium, and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. In theory, this enlarged kingdom would combine Dutch financial power, Belgian industry, and strategic geography into a formidable state. In practice, however, tensions quickly surfaced. The differences between the North and the South were deep and not easily bridged. The North was largely Protestant, with a tradition of trade and seafaring, while the South was overwhelmingly Catholic, with a strong artisan and industrial base. King William I, crowned in 1815, was an energetic and determined ruler, convinced that centralization and modernization were the keys to strength. He invested heavily in industry, infrastructure, and education, believing he could unify his kingdom under one vision of progress. Yet his style was authoritarian, and his policies often alienated Southerners. He favored the Dutch language and administration, imposed heavy controls over the press, and clashed with the Catholic Church over education. Industrialists in the South appreciated his investments, but political liberals and religious leaders grew resentful of his centralized rule. The Belgian provinces began to feel like subjects, not equal partners. In 1830, inspired by the revolutionary wave sweeping across Europe, unrest in Brussels erupted into open revolt. Protesters, initially demanding reforms, soon demanded independence. The Belgian Revolution was fierce but relatively swift. Dutch forces attempted to suppress it, but William I underestimated the strength of the movement and the support it received from other European powers. By 1831, Belgium had declared itself independent, and despite William's refusal to accept this outcome for years, the reality was undeniable. The secession of Belgium cut deeply. The dream of a strong, united kingdom collapsed barely 15 years after its creation. For the Dutch, it was a sobering reminder that unity imposed from above could not override cultural, religious, and political differences. After the loss of Belgium, the Netherlands turned inward, focusing on consolidating what remained. King William I pushed on with modernization, but discontent grew among liberals who wanted more constitutional freedoms. His stubbornness eventually led to his abdication in 1840, passing the throne to his son, William II. The younger king faced the revolutionary fervor of 1848, a year when revolts shook monarchies across Europe. In the Netherlands, demands for change were strong but not violent. Recognizing the danger of resisting, William II agreed to sweeping constitutional reforms. The result was the 1848 Constitution, drafted by liberal statesman Johann Rudolf Thorbecke. It transformed the Netherlands into a constitutional monarchy, where the king reigned but ministers governed. Parliament gained real power, press freedoms were expanded, and the foundations of Dutch parliamentary democracy were laid. This moment marked a turning point. The Netherlands embraced liberal reform not through bloodshed, but through negotiation and adaptation. Meanwhile, industrialization slowly reshaped Dutch society. The Netherlands did not industrialize as rapidly as Britain or Belgium, but changes were undeniable. Steam engines, railways, and factories began to alter landscapes and livelihoods. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and other cities adapted to modern commerce, while textile industries flourished in places like Twente. The rise of industrial workers also brought new social challenges. Poor housing, long hours, and low wages sparked early labor movements and debates about social justice. At the same time, the Netherlands expanded its colonial reach, especially in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. Though the VOC had collapsed in the 18th century, the Crown reasserted control and exploited the colony's immense resources. Under the cultivation system, introduced in the 1830s, peasants were forced to grow cash crops such as coffee, sugar, and indigo, which were then exported to Europe. This system generated enormous profits for the Dutch state, funding domestic projects and filling government coffers. But it came at a terrible cost. For the Javanese population, it meant exploitation, famine, and suffering. Despite its moral problems, the wealth of the East Indies became central to the Dutch economy. Amsterdam's banks and trading houses thrived, and colonial products flooded European markets. In the late 19th century, critics at home and abroad began to question the ethics of the system, planting the seeds for future debates on colonial policy. By the late 1800s, the Netherlands had transformed dramatically. It was no longer the fractured republic of the 18th century, nor the uneasy kingdom of 1815. Instead, it had stabilized into a constitutional monarchy, modernized its infrastructure, and secured a steady if morally complicated source of wealth from overseas. Cities expanded, literacy rose, and Dutch culture began to reflect both the liberal spirit of reform and the tensions of a society adjusting to industrial capitalism. The 19th century ended with the Netherlands more modest in power than during its golden age, but more stable and modern than it had been in centuries. The loss of Belgium had narrowed its borders, yet it had also forced the Dutch to find unity within. The monarchy had accepted constitutional limits, industry had taken root, and colonial riches continued to flow. The stage was now set for the challenges and upheavals of the 20th century, when global wars, decolonization, and social transformation would once again reshape the destiny of the Dutch people. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the Netherlands stood in a very different position than it had at the dawn of the century. It was no longer the uneasy union with Belgium, nor the conservative monarchy of William I's reign. Instead, it had evolved into a stable constitutional state, shaped by liberal reforms and the quiet but steady influence of industrial capitalism. Railways stretched across the countryside, uniting towns and cities in new ways, while ports like Rotterdam and Amsterdam were once again buzzing with international trade. Society too was changing. A growing middle class embraced education, newspapers, and politics, while laborers began to find their voice in early unions and socialist movements. Debates about poverty, workers' rights, and the role of government grew louder, signaling the social struggles of the century to come. At the same time, colonial wealth from the Dutch East Indies remained central to the kingdom's prosperity. Coffee, sugar, and tobacco filled European markets, enriching the treasury in The Hague, but deepening the moral questions about exploitation abroad. The 19th century was, in many ways, a century of balance for the Netherlands, neither a return to the soaring heights of the Golden Age, nor the decline of the 18th century. Instead, it was an age of consolidation and adaptation. The Dutch proved they could survive revolution, secession, and modernization without losing their sense of stability. But beneath this stability, pressures were building: social tensions at home, colonial resistance abroad, and the geopolitical rivalries of an increasingly interconnected Europe. As the century drew to a close, the Dutch entered the 20th century with cautious confidence. They had preserved their independence, redefined their monarchy, and embraced democracy more fully than many neighbors. Yet new storms were approaching. Soon, world wars, occupation, and decolonization would test the resilience of the Dutch nation in ways no 19th century statesman could have imagined. When the 20th century began, the Netherlands was a stable, modestly prosperous constitutional monarchy. Its people enjoyed growing political freedoms, its economy thrived on trade and colonies, and its cities reflected the quiet confidence of a nation that had survived centuries of turmoil. Yet the modern world brought storms that no one could ignore. During the First World War, the Netherlands remained officially neutral. Unlike Belgium, which was invaded and devastated by German armies, Dutch territory was spared the destruction of battle. But neutrality came at a price. The country had to mobilize its army, defend its borders, and carefully balance diplomacy with both the Allied and Central Powers. Trade routes were disrupted, shortages hit the population, and refugees, especially from Belgium, flooded across the borders. Though spared the horrors of trench warfare, the Dutch emerged from the war exhausted and aware of how fragile neutrality could be. 2 decades later, neutrality would no longer protect them. In May 1940, Germany invaded, shattering Dutch defenses within days. The bombing of Rotterdam, which destroyed much of the city centre, forced the Netherlands to surrender. Queen Wilhelmina fled to London, where she became a symbol of resistance. While the country endured 5 years of brutal occupation, life under Nazi rule was harsh. Dutch Jews faced persecution and deportation, with over 100,000 ultimately murdered in the Holocaust. Resistance movements formed, carrying out sabotage, publishing underground newspapers, and assisting those in hiding. Ordinary citizens risked everything to protect neighbors, with figures like Anne Frank becoming enduring symbols of courage and tragedy. The winter of 1944-45, known as the Hunger Winter, brought famine and suffering as food supplies collapsed under the pressure of war. Liberation finally came in May 1945, when Allied forces entered the Netherlands. The relief was overwhelming, but the scars of war, physical and emotional, would last for generations. In the years after the war, the Netherlands embarked on an extraordinary recovery. With the help of the Marshall Plan and its own determination, the country rebuilt its destroyed cities, modernized its industry, and reasserted itself in international trade. Politically, the Dutch joined new international institutions, becoming a founding member of NATO in 1949. In doing so, the Netherlands abandoned the old tradition of neutrality, recognizing that security in the modern world required collective defense. The post-war decades also brought another transformation: the European project. The Netherlands was among the 6 founding nations of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, the seed of what would become the European Union. Integration promised peace, prosperity, and influence beyond what a small nation could achieve alone. For the Dutch, who had seen the devastation of war firsthand, the idea of a united Europe offered hope for a stable future. By the late 20th century, the Netherlands had become known not only for economic recovery, but also for its forward-thinking society. The country embraced social reforms, expanded welfare protections, and cultivated a reputation for openness and tolerance. From the ashes of war, the Dutch had built a modern nation, deeply connected to the world through NATO, the EU, and its global trade networks. The century had begun with fragile neutrality and devastating occupation, but it ended with the Netherlands standing as a stable democracy and a respected voice in Europe and beyond. The challenges had been immense, yet the resilience of the Dutch people had carried them through once again, preparing them for the even greater transformations of the 21st century. By the end of the 20th century, the Netherlands had undergone a journey as dramatic as any in its long history. It had weathered the delicate balancing act of neutrality in the First World War, endured the brutality of German occupation in the Second, and then, against all odds, rebuilt itself into one of Europe's most stable and prosperous democracies. The lessons of war shaped every decision in the post-war decades. Neutrality, once a proud tradition, was set aside in favor of collective security through NATO. The country that had once struggled to hold its independence now stood shoulder to shoulder with other Western democracies, confident that solidarity was the only way to guarantee peace. At the same time, the Netherlands embraced the European project, from the first steps of economic cooperation to full membership in the European Union. The Dutch saw integration not as a loss of sovereignty, but as an extension of their own mercantile traditions, working together across borders for shared prosperity. Rotterdam's port boomed as one of the great gateways of Europe, while Dutch diplomacy played an outsized role in shaping the institutions of the continent. Yet the transformation was not only political or economic, it was also social. Out of wartime hunger and hardship, Dutch society built a modern welfare state. From education to healthcare, from housing to workers' rights, the Netherlands became known for innovation, tolerance, and pragmatism. The tragedies of the Holocaust, the devastation of Rotterdam, and the suffering of the Hunger Winter remained in living memory, serving as constant reminders of what was at stake. By 2000, the Dutch stood at the threshold of a new century, with a firm sense of who they were. A small nation with global reach, a democracy that had survived dictatorship, and a society determined to balance freedom with responsibility. The 20th century had tested them in every imaginable way, but in the end, it had also given them the foundations to step into the 21st with resilience, confidence, and hope. When we look at the Netherlands today, it is hard not to think about the long journey that brought this small but remarkable nation to where it stands. Once a marshy land inhabited by prehistoric tribes, later a Roman frontier, a battleground of dukes and counts, a proud republic of merchants, an empire that sailed the world's seas, a golden beacon of art and science, and a battlefield again in the world wars. The Netherlands has worn many faces across the centuries, and yet, what makes the story of this country so fascinating is not only its past, but also how that past echoes into the present. The Dutch of the 21st century carry within them the resilience of their ancestors, but they live in a nation transformed, a modern democracy, a thriving economy, and a society that continues to balance tradition with innovation. The Netherlands today is often described as a country of paradoxes. It is small in size, yet its influence is vast. It is densely populated, yet it finds ways to preserve green spaces, canals, and a sense of openness. It is deeply rooted in history, yet forward-looking in technology, design, and social policy. The Dutch continued to embody that centuries-old spirit of pragmatism, of facing reality head-on, solving problems with ingenuity, and adapting to change while holding on to core values of freedom, tolerance, and fairness. Politically, the Netherlands has matured into a constitutional monarchy with a strong parliamentary democracy. King Willem-Alexander serves as the head of state, but his role is largely ceremonial, symbolizing continuity with the country's long monarchical tradition. The real decisions are made by the elected parliament, led by the Prime Minister. Dutch politics is famously pluralistic. Rather than 2 or 3 major parties dominating the landscape, the Netherlands has many political parties that represent a wide spectrum of views, from progressive liberals to Christian Democrats, from green activists to conservative populists. This diversity often requires coalition governments, where different parties must learn to compromise and govern together. In many ways, this reflects Dutch society itself, varied, sometimes divided, but held together by negotiation, consensus, and a willingness to find common ground. The Dutch model of governance is deeply tied to their history of water management. For centuries, communities had to cooperate to build dikes, drain polders, and protect their land from the sea. This created a culture of polder politics, where decisions are made not through dominance but through dialogue, consensus, and practical solutions. Even today, when politicians gather in The Hague to debate policy, they are continuing that old tradition of collective problem-solving. It is one of the reasons why Dutch democracy is both resilient and adaptable, even in an age of rapid global change. Economically, the Netherlands is one of Europe's powerhouses. Despite its modest size, it ranks among the world's top economies, thanks to its openness, trade, and innovation. The Dutch have always been merchants at heart, and this legacy endures. Rotterdam's port is still one of the busiest in the world, a gateway for goods entering and leaving Europe. Amsterdam, once the beating heart of the 17th century Golden Age, remains a hub for finance, technology, and culture. Dutch companies like Shell, Philips, Heineken, ING and ASML operate on the global stage, carrying the Dutch reputation for quality, efficiency, and cutting-edge expertise. Agriculture, too, tells a remarkable story. Despite having limited land, the Netherlands has become one of the world's largest exporters of agricultural products, second only to the United States. How? By combining centuries of farming knowledge with high-tech innovation, Dutch greenhouses stretch for miles, glowing at night with artificial lights that nurture crops in carefully controlled climates. Vertical farming, precision irrigation, and sustainable practices have turned the country into a model for feeding the world. In a way, this is just another chapter in the Dutch struggle with nature. Once they fought the sea for survival, now they are harnessing science to feed a growing planet. But the Netherlands is not only an economic powerhouse, it is also a cultural beacon. Dutch society today is known for its liberal values, its openness, and its creativity. Amsterdam, with its canals, museums, and vibrant neighborhoods, continues to attract millions of visitors every year. The Rijksmuseum, the Van Gogh Museum, and the Anne Frank House remind the world not only of the country's artistic genius, but also of its painful history and moral lessons. Dutch artists may no longer dominate the world stage, as in the days of Rembrandt or Vermeer, but the spirit of creativity lives on in Dutch design, architecture, music, and digital culture. From minimalist furniture to innovative bike lanes, from electronic music festivals to fashion houses, the Netherlands continues to punch above its weight culturally. Daily life in the Netherlands reflects both tradition and modernity. The Dutch are famously fond of bicycles, not as a tourist gimmick, but as a way of life. More bikes than people exist in the country, and the cycling infrastructure is world-renowned. Children ride to school, professionals commute to work, and grandparents cycle to markets. It is not just about health or environment, but about a culture that values practicality, community, and human-scaled cities. Likewise, Dutch cities are marked by their blend of historic charm and modern efficiency. A visitor walking through Utrecht or Delft may pass medieval churches, 17th century houses, and futuristic train stations, all coexisting in harmony. Socially, the Netherlands is admired for its progressive policies. It was the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage in 2001, setting an example of equality that inspired others. Its approach to healthcare, education, and social welfare reflects a belief that society should protect the vulnerable while encouraging individual responsibility. Of course, these policies are debated, adjusted, and sometimes criticized, but they embody a larger Dutch value, that freedom should always walk hand in hand with fairness. At the same time, Dutch society is not without its challenges. Immigration has reshaped the country, bringing new cultures, religions, and languages into the Dutch fabric. Moroccan, Turkish, Surinamese, Indonesian, and, more recently, Syrian communities live alongside native Dutch populations. This diversity has enriched Dutch culture, but also sparked debates about integration, identity, and belonging. The balance between tolerance and cohesion is an ongoing struggle, one that echoes older Dutch experiences of religious pluralism and political negotiation. Just as 17th century Amsterdam welcomed Jews, Protestants, and Catholics from across Europe, today's Netherlands must find ways to remain open while maintaining unity. The environment, too, remains a central challenge. The Netherlands still fights the sea, but now in the age of climate change, the battle is even more urgent. Rising sea levels threaten the low-lying lands, and extreme weather puts pressure on the intricate system of dikes and pumps that protect the nation. Yet, once again, the Dutch respond with innovation. Projects like the Delta Works, massive sea defenses built after the catastrophic 1953 flood, show how engineering can turn vulnerability into strength. Today, Dutch engineers export their expertise worldwide, helping countries from New Orleans to Bangladesh to manage water. Climate change has turned the Dutch struggle into a global service. The nation that once saved itself from drowning now teaches others how to do the same. This is the portrait of the Netherlands in the 21st century. Democratic, prosperous, creative, but also facing complex questions about its identity, its environment, and its place in a changing world. And as with every chapter in Dutch history, the story is still unfolding, written by the choices of its people, shaped by their resilience, and guided by the lessons of the past. The Netherlands may be small in size, but on the global stage, it carries a voice far larger than its borders would suggest. Its long history as a trading nation, a colonial power, and a diplomatic player has shaped a unique role in today's international order. Few countries are so firmly embedded in global institutions, and few have embraced the responsibilities of international cooperation as wholeheartedly as the Dutch. Within the European Union, the Netherlands has always been both pragmatic and ambitious. As one of the founding members of the European Economic Community in 1957, the Dutch helped shape what would eventually become the EU. For the Netherlands, integration was not just about economics, it was about survival. A small, open economy needed access to wider markets, and a small nation needed the security of collective power in a continent often torn by rivalry. Today, the EU remains vital to Dutch prosperity. Dutch farmers export across the continent. Dutch companies depend on the single market, and Dutch citizens benefit from open borders. Yet Dutch membership in the EU is not without tension. The Dutch people are famously skeptical and pragmatic. They support cooperation but demand accountability. Debates about EU regulations, financial contributions, and sovereignty are common in Dutch politics. At times, the Netherlands has positioned itself as a cautious voice within the Union, reminding larger powers like France and Germany that integration must balance ambition with realism. In this way, the Dutch carry on their historical tradition, merchants negotiating the best deal, partners committed to cooperation but unwilling to surrender their independence. Beyond the EU, the Netherlands is deeply tied to NATO. For a country whose history includes invasion and occupation, collective defense is no abstraction. The lessons of World War II still shape Dutch thinking about security. Never again should the Netherlands face aggression alone. Dutch soldiers have served in missions from Afghanistan to the Balkans, contributing to global stability even far from home. Though the Netherlands does not boast the largest army, its forces are professional, modern, and integrated into NATO's collective strategy. In the 21st century, as new threats emerge from cyber warfare to global terrorism, the Dutch remain committed to alliance defense, seeing NATO as both a shield and a platform for shared responsibility. But perhaps nowhere is the Netherlands' international identity more visible than in The Hague, the so-called city of peace and justice. Here, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and numerous tribunals and organizations are housed. From war crimes trials to disputes between nations, The Hague has become the world's capital for international law. This role did not come by accident. It reflects both Dutch history, a nation that once prided itself on negotiation and diplomacy, and Dutch values of justice, fairness, and human dignity. The presence of these institutions gives the Netherlands a moral weight on the global stage. When the world seeks justice, it often turns to Dutch soil. This international role is not only about law and diplomacy, it is also about economics and trade. The Netherlands is still one of the world's great trading hubs. Rotterdam's port remains Europe's largest, a gateway for goods flowing between continents. Schiphol Airport connects Amsterdam to the world. Dutch companies, from ASML's microchip technology to Heineken's beer, remain global players. This interconnectedness makes the Netherlands highly dependent on global stability, but also gives it influence in shaping global markets and standards. Yet even as the Netherlands thrives internationally, it faces profound challenges at home. Immigration, one of the defining issues of the 21st century, has reshaped Dutch society. Waves of newcomers from Turkey, Morocco, Suriname, Indonesia, and, more recently, from conflict zones like Syria, have transformed the demographic fabric. Diversity has enriched culture, cuisine, and daily life, but it has also sparked debates about integration and identity. Some Dutch embrace multiculturalism, seeing it as a continuation of the country's long tradition of openness and tolerance. After all, Amsterdam in the 17th century welcomed Jews fleeing persecution, Protestants escaping Catholic dominance, and thinkers silenced elsewhere in Europe. Why should the 21st century be different? Others, however, worry about social cohesion, about whether Dutch values of equality, gender freedom, and secularism can coexist with more traditional or religious communities. These debates have fueled political movements, From liberal defenders of diversity to populist critics who call for stricter immigration policies, the tension reflects not only demographic change but also a deeper question: what does it mean to be Dutch in a globalized world? The environment poses another immense challenge. For centuries, the Netherlands has battled water, building dikes, pumping stations, and the famous delta works, but climate change has altered the stakes. Rising seas threaten to undo centuries of hard-won victories against the ocean. A large portion of the Netherlands lies below sea level. Without constant vigilance, cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague could be submerged. Yet rather than despair, the Dutch innovate. They build floating houses, design floodplains that absorb excess water, and export their water management expertise worldwide. Dutch engineers are sought after by countries from Bangladesh to the United States, turning the Netherlands' vulnerability into a source of strength. Still, the battle is not only against the sea but also against pollution and environmental degradation. As a country with intensive agriculture, the Netherlands faces challenges of nitrogen emissions, soil exhaustion, and pressure on rural communities. Protests by farmers against environmental regulations have shown how deeply these issues affect Dutch society. Balancing sustainability with economic needs is a debate that cuts across politics, business, and daily life. In many ways, it is a modern echo of the old Dutch dilemma: how to harness nature without being destroyed by it. And then there is identity. For centuries, Dutch identity was forged in struggle, against Spain, against the sea, against foreign occupiers. It was built on the values of independence, pragmatism, and tolerance. But in the 21st century, identity is harder to define. Is being Dutch about language, culture, and history? Or is it about values like freedom, equality, and openness? Can one be Dutch while being Muslim, Surinamese, Turkish, or Syrian? These questions play out in politics, media, and daily conversations. They reflect not weakness, but the complexity of a modern, open society grappling with global realities. Yet despite these challenges, the Netherlands remains remarkably cohesive. Its democracy, though tested, endures. Its economy, though pressured, thrives. Its culture, though changing, continues to inspire. And its people, though diverse, share a common resilience inherited from centuries of survival and adaptation. The same spirit that built windmills to drain the land, that sailed ships to the far corners of the globe, that rebuilt cities after war, now faces the uncertainties of the 21st century. The story of the Netherlands in the 21st century is, in many ways, the story of a nation standing at the crossroads of history and modernity. It is a place where windmills still turn against the backdrop of solar panels, where medieval town halls coexist with skyscrapers of glass and steel, where traditions are cherished but innovation drives the future. To understand the Netherlands today, one must see how the threads of its past are woven into its present fabric. The Dutch people have inherited a legacy of resilience and pragmatism, the memory of fighting against floods, of uniting provinces against a foreign empire, of enduring occupation and rebuilding from rubble. All of these experiences continue to shape the national character. This is why, when facing new challenges like climate change or immigration, the Dutch instinct is not despair but problem-solving. We will manage it, they say, and history suggests they usually do. Modern democracy in the Netherlands reflects centuries of compromise and negotiation. Coalition politics may sometimes seem messy, but it is the continuation of that old tradition of polder politics, where communities learned to survive only by working together. Even in an era of populism and political polarization, the Dutch remained committed to institutions, dialogue, and the search for consensus. It is not always easy, but it has allowed this small country to remain stable in times of great change. Economically, the Netherlands stands as proof that size does not determine strength. From the port of Rotterdam to the tech campuses of Eindhoven, from greenhouses feeding the world to financial centers in Amsterdam, the Dutch economy is both global and resilient. The challenges of automation, globalization, and environmental responsibility are real, but so too is the Dutch capacity for innovation. Just as merchants once pioneered global trade routes, today's Dutch entrepreneurs are pioneering in renewable energy, biotech, and digital design. Culturally, the Netherlands continues to leave its mark. It is no longer the golden age of Rembrandt and Vermeer, but Dutch influence can be seen in architecture, music, literature, and social thought. The Dutch are proud of their directness, their creativity, and their openness. Walk through any Dutch city, and you will see diversity in food, fashion, and faces, proof of how global connections have shaped the nation. Yet at the same time, the Dutch hold tightly to traditions. King's Day, with orange-clad crowds filling the streets, Sinterklaas arriving by boat in November, the quiet rituals of cycling through the rain, coffee in hand, or skating on frozen canals when winter permits. These are the rhythms of a nation, both modern and rooted. But the Netherlands also looks outward, not only inward. Its role in international organizations gives it a unique position. The Hague, as the city of peace and justice, symbolizes a nation that believes in rules, fairness, and global cooperation. Dutch diplomats, peacekeepers, and engineers carry their expertise across the world. The Netherlands may be small, but when it speaks on climate, trade, or justice, the world listens. That, too, is part of its identity. A moral voice, amplified by history and credibility. Still, the greatest challenges ahead lie within. Immigration continues to spark debate about what kind of society the Netherlands will be in the future. Will it remain as open and tolerant as in the past, or will pressures of globalization create deeper divides? Climate change threatens the very land on which the Dutch live. Rising seas, melting ice, and unpredictable weather test the engineering marvels that keep the nation dry. And questions of identity, what it means to be Dutch in a multicultural world, touch every aspect of life, from schools to politics to neighborhoods. And yet, when we step back and see the sweep of Dutch history, these challenges are not signs of weakness. They are reminders that the Netherlands has always lived in tension with forces greater than itself, whether the sea, empires, or global markets, and has always found ways not only to survive but to thrive. The same spirit that built dikes, launched ships, and fought for independence continues to guide the Dutch today. So here, at the end of this journey through the entire history of the Netherlands, we find ourselves not with an ending, but with a continuation. History does not stop. It flows, like the rivers that run through the Low Countries. The people of the Netherlands today are writing the next chapter, one that future generations will look back on as we have looked back on theirs. And now, as we close this long story, from the prehistoric tribes who settled the marshlands, to the Roman frontier, the rise of towns and trade, the Burgundian dukes and Habsburg kings, the bloody revolt against Spain, the glorious Golden Age, the struggles of decline, the Napoleonic upheaval, the industrial transformations, the tragedies of world wars, the rebuilding and modernization, and the challenges and triumphs of today, we see the Netherlands not as a frozen picture in time, but as a living, evolving nation. A small country with a big history, and a future still to be written. And here, I want to step out of the historian's voice and speak to you directly. Creating this journey through the entire history of the Netherlands has been a labor of passion. I believe history is more than dates and battles. It is the story of people, of resilience, of lessons that speak to us even today. The Netherlands shows us that even the smallest places can shape the world. That determination can overcome geography, and that identity is something we carry forward through change. If you've joined me on this journey, I thank you. And if you've learned something new, or if you've felt inspired by the Dutch story, I invite you to stay connected. Where we bring history to life, not as dusty archives, but as stories that breathe, teach, and inspire. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love history. Together, we can continue exploring the great stories of our world, one chapter at a time. The story of the Netherlands is complete for now, but history never ends. And so, until our next journey into the past, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.